My name is Rick, and for 3 years I've run this little diner off the highway. It's called Blue Ridge Diner, named after the mountains that aren't too far from here. The place isn't much, just a squat retro building with a flickering neon sign that I've been meaning to fix but never quite get around to it. Inside, it's all chrome and red leather booths, the kind of place my dad used to say had character. It was his diner before it was mine, but he passed away during my last year of college. Heart attack. One moment he was fine, and the next he was gone. That's life, I guess. I didn't plan on running the diner. I had dreams. Nothing too big, just moving to the city, getting a steady job, maybe traveling a little. But when Dad died, I came back to take care of things, and one thing led to another. Before I knew it, I was wiping down the counter, flipping the open sign at 6 every morning and closing up at 10 every night. The diner was all he left me, and letting it go felt wrong, like losing him all over again. So here I am. It's not a busy place. Most of the time it's just me, the hum of the old jukebox in the corner, and the occasional trucker or lost traveler. Regulars are rare, but there's a steady enough trickle of customers to keep the lights on. The coffee's decent, the food's better than you'd expect, and the pie, my dad's recipe. It's damn near perfect. People say it's worth the drive, but they never come back a second time. And, that's fine by me. I live in the apartment upstairs. It's small, but cozy. A single room with a kitchenette and a bed that sags in the middle. Most nights after I lock up, I go upstairs, make myself a sandwich, and fall asleep watching old movies. It's a quiet life. Predictable and, maybe a little lonely, but it suits me. I like the quiet. Gives me time to think. The diner has a secret, though, and it's the kind of secret that could ruin everything if it got out. I don't know how it started or who first discovered it, but it's real. I've seen it happen too many times to doubt it. If you order a coffee, just a plain black coffee, no sugar, no cream, and you follow the rules, you can talk to someone who's gone, someone you've lost. They'll sit across from you in the booth, looking just like you remember, and you can talk to them until the coffee goes cold. The rules are simple but strict. First, you have to drink the coffee before it gets cold. No exceptions. If you don't, they leave, and you can't get them back. Second, you can't touch them. I don't know why, but it's part of the deal. And third, you can only do it once. No repeats. One coffee, one conversation. I didn't make the rules. I don't even know how they work. All I know is that they do. My dad told me about it before he died. Said it'd been part of the diner for as long as he could remember. He never used it though, and neither have I. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the new guy walked in. I was behind the counter, wiping down the same spot I'd already wiped down 3 times, when the door jingled and he stepped inside. He was tall and thin, with dark circles under his eyes, and a nervous energy that made him look like he hadn't slept in days. He paused just outside the door, taking in the empty booths and the hum of the jukebox, then made his way to the counter. "Coffee," he said, sliding onto a stool. "Black." I nodded, grabbed a mug, and poured from the pot. As I set it in front of him, he looked up at me, his eyes sharp and searching. "This is the place, right?" I froze for a second, then forced myself to keep moving, wiping my hands on a towel. "What place are you talking about?" "You know," he said, "the place where you can talk to someone." I didn't answer right away. Most people don't come in knowing about the coffee. They hear about it by accident or stumble on it themselves. But this guy knew. He wasn't guessing. "Who told you that?" I asked. "A friend," he said, his fingers drumming on the counter. "Is it true?" I glanced around at the empty diner. If you're asking, you already know the answer. His shoulders sagged, like he'd been holding his breath and finally let it out. How does it work? I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. You order a coffee, you drink it, they show up. Simple as that. He stared at the mug in front of him, his hands trembling slightly. And they look real? Yeah, real enough, I said. And I can ask them anything? Like, talk about anything? He asked. Until the coffee goes cold, I replied. I watched as he picked up the mug, his hands shaking so badly that some of the coffee sloshed over the rim. He took a sip, wincing at the bitterness, then set it down. For a moment, nothing happened. And then slowly, the air in the diner seemed to shift. It wasn't anything you could see or hear, just a feeling, like the room was holding its breath. And then there she was. She appeared in the booth across from him, looking as solid and real as if she'd walked in off the street. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with long blonde hair and a soft smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The guy stared at her, his mouth opening and closing, like he was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. "Hi, Sam," she said, her voice soft and warm. "Emma?" he whispered. "Is it really you?" I turned away, giving them as much privacy as I could in a place with no doors and thin walls. It wasn't my business what they talked about, and I didn't want to know. I busied myself with wiping down the counter, refilling the napkin dispensers, anything to keep my hands busy while they spoke in hushed tones. By the time the coffee was almost gone, I could tell it was winding down. Sam's voice was desperate now, like he was trying to cram a lifetime's worth of words into a few final minutes. I didn't have to look to know she was fading. That's how it always ended. The coffee would go cold, and they'd disappear, leaving nothing behind but an empty mug and a lot of questions. When it was over, Sam sat there for a long time, staring at the empty seat across from him. Finally, he turned to me, his eyes red and his face pale. "Thank you," he said. I nodded. "You're welcome." As he got up to leave, he hesitated, looking at me like he wanted to say something, but wasn't sure if he should. He didn't press me, just nodded and left. I watched him go, the door jingling softly behind him, then turned back to the counter. The empty mug sat there, a faint ring of coffee staining the bottom. I picked it up, washed it, and put it back on the shelf. It was late afternoon when the bell over the door jingled again. A young woman stepped inside, her backpack slung over one shoulder and her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She couldn't have been older than 19, maybe 20. She glanced around the diner, her eyes lingering on the empty booths, before settling on me behind the counter. "Hi, are you Rick?" she asked. "That's me. What can I get you?" She hesitated, biting her lip. I heard you can do something here. Something special." I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. "Depends on what you mean by special." Her cheeks flushed, and she looked away. I want to talk to my grandmother. Just for a little bit. Is that okay?" I studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, that's okay. You know the rules?" She shook her head. "Drink the coffee before it goes cold. Don't touch them. And you only get one chance. You got it?" She She nodded quickly, her hands fidgeting with the strap of her backpack. I got it. I poured her a mug of coffee and set it on the counter. She picked it up carefully, like it was something fragile, and carried it to a booth near the window. For a moment, she just sat there, staring at the mug like she wasn't sure if she should take the first sip. Then slowly, she raised it to her lips and drank. The diner grew quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, but heavy with expectation. I stayed behind the counter, giving her space while she waited. Didn't take long. A woman appeared across from her, her hair silver and her face lined with wrinkles. She looked kind, her smile soft and warm, the way you'd imagine a grandmother should look. I didn't eavesdrop, but their voices carried across the empty diner. I don't know what to do, Grandma, the young woman said, her voice trembling. I got into 2 schools, one's close to home, but the other school's in California. I don't know which one to pick. The older woman reached out like she wanted to take her hand, but stopped just short, her fingers hovering above the table. Follow your heart, honey. Do what feels right, but don't be afraid to take a chance. Sometimes the best things come when you step outside your comfort zone. They talked for a little while longer, their conversation soft and full of the kind of love that made your chest ache. When the coffee was almost gone, the young woman's voice grew hurried, like she was trying to hold on to the moment for just a little longer. I miss you so much, Grandma. I know, sweetheart, the older woman said. But I'm always with you. You'll be okay. And then she was gone. The young woman sat there for a few moments, wiping her eyes before coming back to the counter. She set the empty mug down and smiled at me, her face still damp, but grateful. Thank you, she said. That meant everything to me. I nodded, not trusting myself to say too much. Good luck with school. She smiled again, then left, the bell over the door jingling softly behind her. The next customer came in about an hour later. He was older, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, with a face that looked like it'd seen its fair share of hard times. He walked with a limp and had an air about him that suggested he didn't take no for an answer. He didn't look around or hesitate, just walked straight up to the counter and sat down. Coffee, he said. Black. I poured him a cup and slid it across the counter. He picked it up, stared at it for a moment, then looked at me. You do that thing here, right? The conversation thing? I nodded. Yeah? You know the rules? I know the rules, he said. He glanced around the diner, then leaned closer. I want to talk to someone. Who? An accountant, he said bitterly. Bastard stole from me. Took everything. I hesitated. Most people came here to reconnect, to say things they never got the chance to say. Not this guy. But it wasn't my place to judge. Okay, I said. Just remember, no touching, and drink the coffee before it goes cold. He didn't respond, just took a long sip and set the mug down. A moment later, the booth in the corner was no longer empty. A man appeared, dressed in a cheap suit with thin glasses perched on the end of his nose. He looked startled at first, glancing around like he didn't understand where he was. Then his eyes settled on the customer, and his expression hardened. Gary, the accountant said. You, Gary spat, his hands gripping the edge of the counter.
You ruined me. You stole everything I had.
I did my job, the accountant said coldly. You were the one who didn't read the fine print.
Oh, don't give me that,
Gary snapped.
I trusted you. I won the lottery and you bled me dry.
Their voices rose, sharp and angry. I kept my distance, pretending to busy myself with a napkin dispenser, but I couldn't help listening.
You could have stopped,
Gary said.
You could have left me something, anything.
The accountant shrugged, his expression indifferent. Well, the thing is, I don't like you, Gary. Gary's hands shook then, and for a moment, I thought he might lunge across the table. Instead, he grabbed the mug and threw it to the floor. It shattered on impact, the sound echoing through the diner. Coffee splattered across the tiles, dark and steaming. The accountant disappeared instantly, like a switch had just been poof, flipped. One moment he was there, and the next he was gone. Gary stood there for a moment, breathing heavily. Then he turned and stormed out the diner without another word, the door slamming shut behind him. I sighed, grabbing a mop and a dustpan. As I cleaned up the mess, I couldn't help but think about what had just happened. I'd always assumed the only way to end the service was to let the coffee go cold. Apparently there was another way. Smashing the cup ended it just as abruptly. I made a mental note and carried on. The rain was relentless that night, drumming against the diner's windows. The neon sign outside buzzed faintly, casting flickering red and blue reflections onto the wet pavement. I just finished mopping up the floor from the earlier incident when the bell over the door jingled again. A man stepped inside, shaking rain off his coat and stomping his boots on the mat. He was broad-shouldered, with sharp features and an air of authority. His eyes, though, those told the real story. They were tired, heavy with something deeper than just a lack of sleep. "You Rick?" he asked. "That's me," I said, leaning on the counter. "What can I do for you?" The man looked around the empty diner, as if making sure no one else was there. Then he walked up to the counter and pulled out a badge, holding it just long enough for me to see before tucking it away. "Detective Andrews," he said. "I've heard some things about this place." I sighed, already knowing where this was going. "What kind of things?" He shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. "That you have a service, something to do with coffee and the dead." I studied him for a moment. He didn't look like the type to believe in rumors, let alone act on them. But there he was, standing in my diner on a rainy night, desperation etched into every line on his face. "You know the rules?" I asked. "I've heard 'em," he said. "Drink the coffee before it goes cold. No touching, one chance only." "Then you know how it works," I said. "Who do you want to talk to?" He hesitated. "A man named Victor Kane." The name sent a chill down my spine. Even I'd heard of Victor Kane, the infamous serial killer who terrorized the region years ago. He was dead now, killed in a prison riot, but his crimes had left scars that hadn't healed. "Why him?" I asked. Andrews ran a hand through his rain-soaked hair, his eyes darting to the window before locking onto mine. "There's another killer out there. We found a body yesterday, mutilated in ways I will not describe. But there were details. Details that match Kane's work. Problem is, Kane's dead. If this is a copycat, they're taking it to a whole new level. I need answers, Rick. And if there's even a chance that bastard knows something, I'll take it. I hesitated. Everything about this felt wrong. But it wasn't my place to say no. You're sure about this? Do I look like I have another option? He said, sighing and then softening his tone. I'm sorry, I just please let me do this. I nodded reluctantly and poured him a cup of coffee. As I set it on the counter, I couldn't help but feel like I was lighting a fuse on a bomb. Andrews took the mug, his hand steady, despite the weight of what he was about to do. He carried it to a booth in the corner and sat down, staring at the coffee like it might bite him. And then, with a deep breath, he took a sip. The diner went still, that heavy, expectant silence settling over everything. I stayed behind the counter, watching as Andrew sat rigid in his seat. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air in the diner seemed to grow colder, and a figure appeared across from him. Victor Kane was exactly as I'd imagined him from the old mugshots. Tall, gaunt, with sunken eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. But there was something off about him. He didn't just look real. He looked wrong. His presence filled the diner like a storm cloud. Andrews didn't flinch. Victor Kane, he said, his voice steady. The ghost smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was the kind of smile that made you want to run. Detective Andrews, he said. What an unexpected pleasure. I need information, Andrews said, cutting straight to the point. There's a killer out there mimicking your work. I need to know who it could be. Kane leaned back, crossing his arms. Oh, I'm flattered. Really, I am. But why would I help you? Because if you don't, more people will die, Andrews said. And I don't think even you want someone stealing your spotlight. Kane's smile widened. You're wrong about that. I don't mind a little competition. Keeps things interesting. This isn't a game, Kane. Just tell me what you know. The ghost expression darkened, his smile fading. You don't get it, do you? You think I have answers, but I don't. Whoever this is, they're not copying me. They're surpassing me. And frankly, I think that's beautiful. Andrew slammed his hand on the table. Damn it, Kane, people are dying. Don't you care at all? Kane began to laugh. Care? Oh, detective, you really don't understand me at all. The moment Kane said that, the air in the diner shifted. Plates began to rattle on shelves. The lights flickered. My heart pounded as I watched one of the plates fly off the cabinet and smash against the window. Another followed, then another, the sound of shattering ceramic echoing through the small space. Kane stood, his presence looming larger now. Oh, detective, you thought you could control this. You thought I'd play by your rules. Before either of us could react, he turned his head sharply, his dark eyes locking onto something or someone behind me. I followed his gaze and froze. Maggie, the waitress who worked the evening shifts on occasion, was standing by the counter, holding a tray of clean silverware. She looked stunned, her mouth slightly open as she stared at Kane. I didn't even know she'd come in. She must have slipped through the back door to avoid the rain. Kane's smile widened, and faster than I thought possible. He was next to her,
a knife, one of ours, in his hand, and he held it against her neck. Maggie let out a sharp gasp, her tray clattering to the floor, forks and knives scattering everywhere. "Not another step," Kane said. "Oh, don't worry, Rick. I'm not going to kill her yet. I just want to see what happens when I break all your little rules."
"What the hell is this?" Andrews said. "He's a ghost. He shouldn't be able to touch her."
"Shouldn't, no, but can," Kane said, pressing the blade closer to Maggie's skin. "And isn't this fun?" I grabbed the coffee cup from the table where Andrews had been sitting and hurled it to the ground, smashing it into a dozen pieces. Kane didn't even flinch. "Nice try, but I don't think your little parlor trick works like you think it does."
"Rick," Andrews said, keeping his gun trained on Kane. "What do we do?" My mind raced. The rules. I thought about the rules. Until the coffee gets cold. That was the only way to end it. The coffee. My eyes darted to the table. The mug was shattered, but the liquid had pooled on the floor. It was still warm. The faint steam rising from it confirmed that. While Kane's attention was on Andrews, I bolted behind the counter, grabbing the first thing I could find, a pitcher of water. Without thinking, I rushed back to the table and poured the cold water over the coffee on the floor. The reaction was immediate. Kane stiffened, his head snapping toward me, the knife falling from his hand and clattering onto the tiles. His form flickered, like a bad signal on an old TV. He let out a low, guttural sound, his face twisting into something far more inhuman than it had been before. And then he was gone. Just like that, the diner was silent again, except for Maggie's quiet sobs and the steady patter of rain. Maggie stumbled across from where Kane had been, clutching her arms as if trying to hold herself together. "It's over," I said. Andrews lowered his gun, his expression dark. "You knew that would work." "I didn't know," I admitted. "But the rules said until the coffee gets cold. I figured maybe cold water would work." Andrews nodded slowly, holstering his gun. I turned to Maggie, who was still trembling. "You okay?" She nodded weakly, though her face was pale. I think so." "Go home," I said softly. "Get some rest, all right? I'll cover the rest of your shift." She nodded again, her movements stiff, and hurried out the back door, disappearing into the rain. Andrew stayed for a moment longer, his jaw tight and his eyes burning with frustration. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I didn't know it would get out of control like that." "It's all right, it's not your fault," I said. He nodded. "I thought I could handle it, but hell, I don't know what I thought." I didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. He turned toward the door. "Thanks for stepping in, Rick. You saved her." "Yeah," I said, not looking at him. "Just don't come back for this, all right? Not for this." Andrews didn't reply. He just pushed the door open and walked out into the rain, leaving me alone with the broken pieces of ceramic, the spilled water, and the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. I grabbed the mop again and got to work. The days after the incident with Detective Andrews passed in a blur. The diner was back to its usual rhythm. Quiet, with just enough business to keep the lights on. Regulars didn't mention anything unusual, and new customers were none the wiser. But for me, things weren't the same. The memory of Victor Kane's ghost still lingered in the back of my mind. Every time I brewed a pot of coffee, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting something or someone to appear. I told myself it was over, that I'd followed the rules and put it behind me. But late at night, when the diner was empty and the only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards, the weight of it pressed down on me. I'd gotten forgetful, leaving salt shakers unfilled and neglecting to flip the sign to open a couple mornings. Maggie had been patient, gently reminding me of the small things, but she didn't blame me. Nobody did. The weight of running the diner was starting to feel heavier than ever. It was late one night, early morning really, when it happened. The clock on the wall read 3:18 a.m. and the diner was empty. Rain pattered softly against the windows, a gentle rhythm that made the night feel even quieter. I was trying to keep busy, scrubbing the already clean counter for the third time, when I decided to make myself a cup of coffee. I didn't think much about it, just grabbed a mug, poured it black, and set it on the counter. I didn't drink it right away, just let it sit there as I turned to organize the napkins and condiments. The smell of the coffee filled the air, warm and familiar, and for the first time in weeks, I felt some comfort. And then I heard it. "Ricky." I froze. The voice was low and soft, coming from just behind me. My heart skipped a beat. There was only one man who ever called me Ricky. My dad. I turned slowly, my eyes landing on the coffee mug sitting on the counter. And then I saw him. He was sitting on one of the stools, just like he used to when we worked together. He looked exactly as I remembered. Broad shoulders, slightly graying hair, and that easy smile that could light up a room. His favorite flannel shirt was neatly tucked into his jeans, and his hands rested casually on the counter, like he'd been there all along. "Hey, kiddo," he said, his voice warm and familiar. I stared at him, my throat tightening. "Dad?" "Yeah," he said. "It's me." I didn't know what to say. 100 thoughts raced through my mind, but none of them made it past my lips. Finally, I managed. "I didn't mean to call you." "I know," he said, nodding toward the coffee. "I guess it just worked out that way." I sank onto the stool across from him, my hands shaking slightly. "How are you here?" He chuckled. "Same way all those other folks show up, I suppose. You made the coffee. And well, I figured it was about time we had a talk." "About what?" I asked. "About you. And this place," he said. We sat there in silence for a moment. Finally, he spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. "You've been doing a good job, Ricky. Better than I ever could hope for. Keeping the place running, looking after it like it mattered. I'm proud of you." I felt a lump in my throat and looked down at my hands. I didn't want to let you down. "You haven't," he said. "Not once. But, Ricky, it's time to let go." I looked up at him, startled. "What do you mean?" "This diner," he began. "It's a part of me, sure, a part of us. But it's not all there is. Not for you." I shook my head, the words catching in my throat. "I don't know how to let it go, Dad. It's all I've had since you left." He reached out like he wanted to touch my hand, but stopped just short, his fingers hovering above the counter. "I know, son.
But this isn't your dream. Never was. You stayed because you thought you had to. Because you're a good son. But you've been holding on to this place and to me for too long now. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I blinked them away. I don't even know what I want anymore. I haven't thought about it in so long. Yes, you do, he said. You've always wanted something different than this. You wanted to move to the city, chase your dreams. You wanted to live your life. You still can, you're still young. This place doesn't have to hold you back. But what about... I started, but he cut me off gently. I'll always be with you, Ricky. No matter where you go or what you do. You don't need this diner to remember me. You've already got me here. He tapped his chest, right over his heart. I looked away. I don't know how to say goodbye. You don't have to, he said. You're not saying goodbye to me, just to this place. It's okay to move on, Ricky. You've done your part. We talked for a while after that, about little things and big things, about memories of him teaching me to cook, and the time we stayed up late fixing the leaky roof. His voice was steady, calm, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. The coffee was growing cold, and I knew our time was running out. He seemed to know it too, his smile turning bittersweet. Ricky, he said, promise me you'll think about what I said. Promise me you'll take that step. I nodded, my voice cracking. I promise. Good, he said. That's my boy. And then he was gone. The stool he'd been sitting on was empty, and the only thing left was the faint smell of coffee and the sound of the rain. I sat there for a long time, staring at the mug in front of me. The coffee was cold now, untouched, but the warmth in my chest remained. My dad was right. It was time to let go. Time to move on. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, I felt ready to find out.
Hey, thank you for listening. We have some really great stories coming up on this channel the next few weeks. And if you like true stories, head over to the second channel, Lighthouse, and check it out. Have a good night.